go ahead and get started here. My name is Sarah. Thank you very much for coming this evening. Got a few little housekeeping things to take care of, and then we will go ahead and turn this over to our guest of honor, Mr. Rich Aarstad. So, thank you very much to MCAT for being here to record for us, so we can make these programs more available to folks who can't come. This NEA Big Read program would not be happening without the support from the Missoula Public Library Foundation, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, the Friends of the Missoula Public Library, and support from the National Endowment for the Arts. So thanks to all of those folks for supporting us in this. And tonight we also have Missoula Field Consultant Tom Burgess here to introduce our speaker. And Tom has been involved in organizing for more than 4 decades and has also known our guest Rich for more than 20. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, I haven't been involved in organized labor for more than 4 decades, but I'm in my 4th decade. Rich and I met over 20 years ago when I was a field consultant working in Helena. I now live in Missoula. So when I was contacted by one of my other colleagues to step in and introduce Rich, I was really excited because he's an amazing man and he really knows what he's doing and he knows his stuff and he knows the history of organized labor better than anyone I know. So I'm proud to introduce him tonight. Rich Aarstad is a University of Montana graduate and received his master's degree from the University of Montana as well. He has brought with him his lovely wife, Kim, of 34 years. She's in the back room, and he has recently joined the Academy of National Archivists, certified archivists, and he is the Montana State historical archivist. Did I say that right? He has a son named Rick, a daughter-in-law named April, 2 lovely granddaughters named Chesney and Cashlyn, yes. And wealth of knowledge about many things, but he's really good at the history of organized labor. So without further comments, I'd like to introduce Rich Aarstad.
Well, looks like I owe Tom dinner. I did go to the University of Montana, got my bachelor's degree, got my master's degree. So I'm going to tell you what Harry Fritz told us when we were in his history class. If it didn't happen that way, it should have. And if you say it with enough authority, they'll believe you. So there's a little bit of that in here. Not much, just a skosh. I put this together last year for the Bozeman Public Library. We did the same book and so forth. And so basically what I did was just script out kind of a brief history of what was going on in Montana during the time frame that the book Cold Millions takes place. So it covers some of the topics that the author talks about in the book. It talks about some of the things that happened before that and a few of the things that happened after. And I typically wind it up about 1920. So Tom and I have known each other for over 20 years. Whew, it's a long time. I got started on the IWW history, the industrial workers of the world, when I worked on my thesis. I was raised in Libby, Montana, up in the northwest corner of the state. And when I was at U of M and I was getting ready to do my master's degree, my thesis advisor, Dave Emmons, asked me what I wanted to do my thesis on. I said, I don't know. I said, this is Montana. I was thinking maybe Conrad Coors from down in Deer Lodge. And he said, absolutely not. You'll find something from Libby and you'll do it on Libby because nobody knows anything about Libby. And so it's like, oh, okay. So I did. I actually found out about a strike that the IWW started in Eureka, Montana, 2 weeks after the United States declared war on Germany in 1917. That was the first place in the United States that federal troops were used to break a strike during World War I. And by the time the strike was over in the fall of 1917, it had spread from Eureka, Montana, all the way to the Pacific West Coast. And the United States was actually diverting frontline military troops to Washington and Oregon to cut timber. The strike was that big. And it started in Libby, or started in Eureka. Well, Libby, Eureka, they're kind of interchangeable. So we won the county seat. That's all that matters, right? Right. So that's kind of what got me started on this, and I really haven't stopped. It's just kind of continued since I got to the Historical Society. So Montana is a unique place. We are surrounded by right-to-work states. Idaho went right to work in the 1980s. The Dakotas both went in the 1940s. Wyoming went in 1963. Montana is still a labor state. And I say that because over the last 2 legislative sessions, Montana Labor has put down 8 right-to-work bills. 8 that didn't even make it to the governor's desk. It's pretty impressive considering that we don't have the industrial union density that we did back in the day. Unions started early and often in Montana. So anybody tell me where the first union was established in Montana? Pop quiz. You didn't study, did you? Any guesses? Miles City? Yeah. But I give you credit for not saying Butte. So it was actually Helena. In 1866, the Typographical Union established a union for the entire territory in 1866. Had their first strike in 1867 and 1868 against, I think, 3 of the maybe 4 newspapers that were in the territory at the time. So a full 12 years before Butte actually got into the action, you're seeing labor establish a presence in Montana. And it's never left. And it's just grown from there. And so Montana is one of those interesting western states, like we've all read about, that has basically been, well, I can say this because this is Missoula. It's been pillaged by out-of-state interests who have come in for the copper, for the silver, for the gold, for the timber, whatever they can extract out of the land and then ship out. And so that created what looked like a fairly stable economy early on, but really didn't prove to be so. And that's one of the reasons that unions were able to get such a strong foothold in Montana going forward, is because of the uncertainty within those. And I'm already behind on my slides. There we go. So first strike of major notice, of course, is in Butte in 1878, when A.J. Davis and the Alice Mine owners decided that they were going to cut the wages of unskilled miners by 50 cents. So from $3.50 a day to $3 a day. And so the unskilled miners, and I'm not sure what an underground unskilled miner does, but nevertheless, unskilled, they went out on strike. And an interesting thing happened. The skilled miners went out with them. That hadn't happened before. And in rather short order, without the interference of law enforcement or federal troops or anything like that, the strike was settled and the unskilled miners got their 50 cents back. And the Butte workers realized that they were onto something, that maybe they should keep going. And so they created the Butte Workers Union and so forth. The early point would allow anybody within their ranks. It didn't matter what you did. You didn't have to be a miner or anything like that to belong. As long as you paid dues, you could be a full member and join up. Once the union was started, within less than 2 weeks, they had 300 members, which, if you're thinking about Montana in 1878, that's pretty impressive. I mean, that's a large number of the workforce. In part, I think one of the reasons that the mine owners were so quick to settle a strike, even in remote Montana at the time, was because what happened the previous year nationally. And we're kind of seeing some of that now with some of these organic strikes that are popping up all over the country. The United Auto Workers, the postal, the UPS drivers, some of the teacher strikes and so forth that happened 2 or 3 years ago, and so forth. The same thing happened in 1877 with the railroads. Started in Martinsdale, West Virginia, and by the time it was over, it had hit Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. And so this was one of the instances where this was the first instance where the federal government, the president at the time, Rutherford B. Hayes, decided that he needed to use federal troops to break the strike because the strike activity was interfering with interstate commerce and the railroads and the mail and all of that kind of good stuff. When he did so, he cautioned everybody that this isn't the answer to the problem. We have to figure out a way that we can have employers and employees talk to one another and settle their differences without us resorting to violence. And so that's what they worked on. Um, so in the 1890s, uh, the economy was fairly unstable, somewhat like it is today. They called it the Gilded Age. People are referring to what we're going through today. This is the second Gilded Age. You had the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which was repealed, which devalued the price of silver, which put a lot of the mines in Montana out of business, and created a slew of unemployed individuals. It also hit the panhandle of Idaho pretty bad in 1893. We all are familiar with the panhandle of Idaho for being east-west on I-90, right? Mullen, Wallace, all those little places through there and so forth. The interesting thing about that is, like Butte, they organized early, but they were independent little unions. I mean, they were just local unions, and the mine owners figured out rather quickly that they could beat the union simply by isolating them and not allowing them to create ties outside the community and so forth. So what they would typically do is round them up and throw them in bullpens in the center of town. And a bullpen was basically just a stockade without a roof that they herded the miners in that were on strike, and they kept them locked up in there while they had scabs work the mines and so forth. And they were able to break the little local unions that were in those working out of those mines in the panhandle of Idaho. And the governor of Idaho at the time, Frank Steunenberg, was complicit in that and used state troops to help the mine owners break this strike, even though he was supposedly in favor of organized labor. So the very next year, in 1894, the miners decided that if they were actually going to have a union that could take on the Mine Owners Association, they were going to have a bigger, better organized union. And so they met in Butte, and they created the Western Federation of Miners. And the Western Federation of Miners would have a huge impact, not just on the Rocky Mountain West, but Montana as well. The Western Federation of Miners only organized hard rock miners. They, by and large, stayed away from coal, although they dabbled a little bit in it in Wyoming. They never got serious about it. They put their base headquarters in Denver. The first two presidents of the Western Federation of Miners were organized or elected out of the Butte Miners Union, which became Local 1 of the WFM. And they were so radical that they almost tore their organization apart. So when they had their third annual convention, they passed a resolution that they couldn't elect anybody from Butte ever again. And they didn't until 1930s. So they actually stuck to it for quite a while. And they were pretty successful. Big Bill Haywood was part of the Western Federation of Miners, Charles Moyer, George Pettibone, and so forth. And they brought it together. About the same time that the Western Federation of Miners was created in Butte, you also saw the creation of the Montana State Trades and Labor Council. This was a umbrella organization that would later on become the Montana Federation of Labor, which is now the Montana AFL-CIO. So it has early roots in Montana as well as in the 1890s. The interesting thing about the creation of these two bodies is the fact that they got together and decided that the one thing that unions weren't doing were organizing the unskilled worker. And so that was of interest to them, is to make sure that the unskilled worker had an avenue of redress when it came to excesses from the companies and so forth. So they created what became the Western Labor Union, which later changed its name to the American Labor Union, apparently to protect the innocent. Nobody knows for sure. And their sole purpose was to organize unskilled workers. And so some of the unskilled workers that they organized were individuals that were working in the hotel and restaurant business, individuals who worked in laundries. They had barbers down too, which kind of confused me because I think I would want a skilled barber. My dad cut my hair for a lot of years. There was not a lot of skill there. There was a lot of cussing, but not much skill. So, and I went through my preteen years with some really bad haircuts. So, you see these organizations start to come together as industrialization really starts to kick off big in the state. And Montana is not just playing within its own borders through all of this. I mean, they're part of the national effort that's afoot at the same time. And so one of those big efforts in 1894 was Jacob Coxey and Coxey's Army. Jacob Coxey was a businessman from Ohio who felt bad about seeing all the unemployed men marching up and down the streets through town looking for jobs, especially when he was riding in his buggy to his job site and bouncing through all the potholes and so forth in the street. So he came up with this idea for an infrastructure bill. Now, if you think infrastructure bills are contentious now, they've always been contentious. We don't like potholes, but we don't like to pay to fill them either. So it was the same way back here in 1894. Coxey actually got a legislator to introduce a bill, the Good Roads Bill, that would build new roads and fix old roads and put these unemployed men to work so that they were actually part of the economy and they could feed themselves and so forth, and they weren't a drain on society and all of this kind of good stuff, and they weren't ending up in the county lockups because, well, they were basically indigent. And the bill failed rather spectacularly. So Coxey called on the unwashed, if you will, and told them that they needed to march on Washington, D.C. and lobby their Congress. And so it was a petition with boots on, is what he called it. And they were to walk to Washington, D.C. from wherever they were. Some of the industrial armies that were organized came from as far away as Oregon and Washington and California and proceeded east. Now, it's a long way to Washington, D.C. It's a long way to Washington, D.C. from Butte, Montana. There was a gentleman there by the name of William Hogan who tried to get the city fathers and the county commissioners to pay train fare for about 500 of them to ride to at least as far as St. Louis so they could just walk from St. Louis to D.C. because it's a lot shorter. That seems doable, right? Well, the city fathers said, no, we're not going to pay. And so then he went to the Northern Pacific Railroad and asked nicely, hey, can you give us a free ride to St. Louis? Just as far as St. Louis. We'll take it from there. Just get us that far. And the Northern Pacific said, absolutely not. And while you're chewing on that, we're going to go to Helena real quick and get a federal injunction saying that you can't borrow a train from us either. Now, William Hogan was a smart man and knew what was coming. And so he got together with some of the boys and they borrowed a train from the Northern Pacific. And they hitched up one boxcar to it for provisions and 6 coal cars to haul the miners in. 6 coal cars. And according to the newspapers, they headed out of town like a bat out of hell. And they were getting telegrams along the way telling them to slow down and all of this kind of good stuff. And they were, I guess, stopping a telegram back that we're running this train, not you. The interesting thing is that they're running from the law because there's been a federal injunction issued that says you can't steal the train. You just can't do it. So they're outlaws. They leave Butte. They got to go all the way to Washington, D.C., and for whatever reason, they decide to spend the night in Columbus. Don't know if somebody had a hot idea on a mulligan stew feed or what, but they spent the night in Columbus. As they spent the night in Columbus, federal authorities had a chance to get their act together a little bit, and they took off in the chase, and they realized that all of a sudden, oh, there's a pursuit going on here. We're going to take off again, like a bat out of hell again. And they got to Billings. And they stopped in Billings, probably for water and coal and all of that kind of good stuff that makes the train go. While they were in Billings, they actually got into a gunfight with the authorities there. And 2 individuals were killed, several were wounded, and so forth. And they actually fled from Billings again. Now, you would think after a gunfight, there would be a certain sense of urgency to your trek here to get out of town, or at least get out of the state. They stopped in Forsyth to spend the night. And it's okay. Well, if you're gonna do this, let's do it in stages. Governor Rickards for Montana at the time sent a telegram to Grover Cleveland, the president of the United States, and said, "We've got a real problem here, and we can't seem to control it. And I'm wondering if you can dispatch federal troops from Fort Keogh to arrest these guys." And so that's what happens. Elements from the 22nd Infantry based at Fort Keogh get on a train and go wake the Coxey's Army unit up in Forsyth and say, "You're under arrest." And they load them up and take them all to Helena to stand trial for federal charges. Now, you'd think stealing a train and getting into a gunfight that results in at least 2 deaths, you're looking at some pretty stiff sentences, right? I mean, you would think grand theft train, murder, I mean, that's pretty serious. William Hogan, the leader of the group that left Butte, was charged with contempt of court and sentenced to 60 days in the county lockup. His lieutenants were each sentenced to 30 days, and the other 470 stood before Judge Knowles, Hiram Knowles, and swore on a Bible that they would not steal a train again, and they were released into the into the town of Helena, and Helena didn't want them. So what they did was they packed them up and shipped them to Fort Benton with enough money to buy lumber so that they could build boats, float down the Missouri River as far as St. Louis, and then walk from there. 3 boats made it. When they got off the boats in St. Louis, they all just kind of went and they scattered. So I'm not sure if anybody from Montana actually made the march on Washington, D.C., but they gave it one hell of a try. And Governor Rickards realized that, man, we've got an issue here with all these unemployed individuals in the state, so we're going to create the Montana Department of Labor and Industry. It was called Agriculture, Labor, and Industry back in the day, and named the first commissioner of labor in 1894, a gentleman by the name of James Mills. And Mills's job was twofold. One, figure out a way to control the unemployed in the state of Montana, and 2, do a census of the number of people in Montana. There's never been a state census done in the state of Montana. And given the last 2 legislative sessions, it seems pretty clear that nobody's quite figured out how to control labor in the state either. So he's 0 for 2. But, I mean, you got to give him credit. So there's a lot going on. And that's not the only thing going on in 1894. You have this strike back in Chicago with the Pullman factory. Pullman's the individual that made the fancy sleeping cars and so forth for the railroads, that if you could afford it, you could have at least some sort of a bunk on your way across the Great Plains and so forth, so you didn't have to stare out the window. Pullman had created a model community around his factory for making these cars. They own the company, they own the store, they own the plant. If you worked there, you bought from the store, you got paid by the company, and you paid rent on the house. So when the father retired from the business, the son decided to modernize the plant. And in doing so, he put a lot of the skilled craftsmen out of work. And he could hire cheap immigrant labor to do the job. So the craftsmen for the Pullman company, they went out on strike. They didn't have a lot of power because of how localized they were, so they turned to the gentleman on the slide, Eugene Debs, who was the president of the American Railway Union, and they asked him if he and his union could help. And the ARU had members all across the West, and so Debs wasn't real keen on going on strike, but he said that the ARU would be happy to boycott any train carrying a Pullman car. And so that was the deal that he made with the Pullman folks. And that's what they told the railroad barons, was that they would handle any car that came through as long as it didn't have a Pullman on it. Now, I haven't been able to confirm this or not, but legend has it that the first such train with a Pullman car attached to it hit Livingston, Montana in 1894, and the ARU members there refused to do anything about it. Now, the railroad barons knew what this would do to business if they could actually pull this boycott off, but they had some aces up their sleeves as well. And so what they decided was to put a Pullman car on every single train and couple it right behind the mail car. So by refusing to work the train that had the mail car on it because it had a Pullman car, you're creating a federal offense because you're messing with the mail. And so that allowed the railroad companies to go to the president and say, we need troops to break this up because they are messing with not only interstate commerce, but federal mail. And so once again, troops were dispatched from Fort Keogh, Miles City. There you go. Miles City is in the mix. To break up the strike. So they posted troops in Billings and in Livingston. And so this is the photograph of them in Billings. And if you look closely, there's Calamity Jane, just dropping in for a visit with the boys. Nobody's really quite sure why, but she's there. It didn't take long once the federal government got involved in the strike for it to fall apart. Pullman fell apart. Eugene Debs and several of the officials of the American Railway Union were arrested and thrown in prison. This would be one of several prison visits for Debs. And it was pretty much over, but you still had a whole lot of dissatisfied individuals around. And so here's just a brief glimpse of some of the labor activities that are going on in the 1890s, along with the creation of some of the unions and so forth that were established to combat what they considered was corporate overreach and so forth. And you can see that they actually kind of parallel one another going forward. So this is the national level. This is what's going on in Montana between 1886 and 1894. That's a lot of strikes. And that's not just mining. That's granite cutters, that's laundries, that's meat cutters, that's newspaper people. It's just about anybody that you can imagine. In the 1890s, Montana was one of the most union organized states in the union. Yeah. So it was a union state. Excuse me. So pretty impressive. As I mentioned earlier, the Western Federation of Miners had kicked off with the Montana Federation of Labor to create the Western Labor Union to organize the unskilled workers. And one of the individuals' trades that they targeted and so forth was the timber industry, which would play a pretty big role in the development of Missoula and so forth, and down into the Bitterroot and along the Clark Fork and so forth. So I put this up because this is the oldest union card that we have in the collection. And it's in pretty tough shape, so it's pretty obvious that the gentleman packed it in his wallet for a number of years. It was issued in 1899 for the St. Regis Lumber Workers Union in St. Regis, Montana. So the ALU was actually doing its work early and often in organizing those unskilled workers. Anybody that worked in the woods was considered unskilled. Anybody that worked in the mill, or most of the individuals that worked in the mill, were considered skilled. Growing up in Libby and having a father who worked in the woods, I'd flip that. Just for general purposes. I mean, nobody liked a mill worker. They wore funny shoes. They had flat soles. It just wasn't right. So, the ALU actually had a fair amount of success working with the Montana Federation of Labor, organizing loggers and so forth. These individuals were primarily single. They had no permanent address, and they packed what was their life on their back from place to place to place. And so if you look around and you see some of the issues that we're having with the homeless and so forth now, yeah, that's kind of what you're looking at. So these individuals were easy prey for unscrupulous employment agencies and so forth. And they had some operating here in Missoula. They had several operating out of Spokane. Missoula and Spokane were kind of those gathering places where workers would show up and try to find more employment, or if they hit town with a wad of cash, spend it as quickly as possible and then look for a job again. I mean, that's just kind of the way it went. They weren't really end of the line places. Missoula and Spokane weren't. But they did have their Skid Row, um, where they could fleece these individuals rather quickly. So again, they made Missoula and Spokane prime places for labor organizers to show up to see if they could get workers signed up and on board. Now, it wasn't just industrial workers that were, like I said, organized back in the day. The Retail Clerks Association, Protective Union, I'm sorry, Local 12 represented those individuals who worked in the stores throughout Montana. And this was a union that was affiliated with the American Labor Union. So it wasn't part of the AFL. It wasn't considered a craft trade. These were just individuals who took money and so forth and sold merchandise. One of the biggest employers in the state of Montana was Hennessy's. Daniel J. Hennessy and his brother, I think just DL. So Hennessy's was the big mercantile in Butte where the Anaconda Company had its offices up on the upper floor and so forth. The Anaconda Company actually owned shares in Hennessy's. Hennessy's had a store here in Missoula. They had a store down in the Bitterroot and so forth. And so in 1900, the retail clerks negotiated a deal with all the stores that were organized for a shorter workday. And essentially what they were asking for is that the workday would end at 6 p.m. instead of being open until 8 or 10. And so that would shorten up the workday. All the merchants that were part of that agreed except for one, Hennessy's. And Hennessy told them to go pound sand. And so the clerks at Hennessy's went out on strike in Butte and in Missoula briefly as well for that early, as what they called early closing and so forth. Dan sent a letter to his brother here in Missoula saying that the individuals that were picketing outside of his store in Butte were led by a bunch of hoodlums that liked to scream scabs at those individuals that were coming in and out of the stores. And so because Hennessy was so well connected, he was able to convince the Butte City Police to arrest the leaders of the strike effort in Butte and throw them in jail, at least for overnight, before they could get released and so forth. Any way to break up the strike. They had a small store in Centerville, which is one of those ethnic communities and so forth that was located in Butte. And a gentleman worked there named D.C. Barden. Barden had clerked at Hennessy's before, and then he went to work in the mines and had been a member of the miners' union. And when the strike happened at Hennessy's, he decided that he would rather be a clerk than a miner. So he decided to cross the picket line and go to work for Hennessy's again. So he became a scab. On his way home one evening, he was greeted by 7 individuals who were driving a hack. And they invited him on board for a ride, and they took him several miles out of town and dumped him off and told him to keep walking and not come back. Well, Barden came back and informed the local authorities of what occurred to him and asked that charges be filed and so forth. And I went too far. Let's go back. There we go. Asked that charges be filed against these guys for kidnapping. They couldn't really decide how they were going to charge them with kidnapping. The strike started in April of 1900, and it didn't get settled until November. So this is a pretty long strike for retail clerks to be out on. How they survived and so forth, it's hard saying. Most of the newspapers at the time were owned by the Anaconda Company, so you weren't getting a lot of true news. What you were getting from the other side came from William Andrews Clark and Augustus Heinze, who were using this opportunity to poke needles in the Anaconda Company. So one of the ways that they did that is an unidentified individual circulated what they called a dodger, basically just a flyer around town talking about how terrible Hennessy's was and that they didn't believe in God and they didn't believe in having Sundays off and all this kind of good stuff. Well, Hennessy's and the Anaconda Company immediately blamed Heinze and Clark for the flyer, and the retail clerks immediately said, "Hey, we didn't have anything to do with this." They did have the backing of the other unions within Butte, as well as the Silver Bowl Trades and Labor Council. So the way the strike was settled was that the Butte Miners Union, along with the leaders of the American Labor Union, sat down with Hennessy's managers, and the Butte Miners Union said, you know what? We have no problem with you guys closing at 6 p.m. So you need to stop telling everybody that the only reason you're staying open is to serve us, because we're good with an early closing. And the ALU said, well, if that's the case, then you really have no reason to be out on, or you have no reason to deny these guys the early closing. And so they settled the strike. They didn't call it a settlement. They said they stabilized the situation. The boycott was listed. Everybody stopped calling everybody else names and so forth, and life moved on. In 1904, Anaconda actually decided that they were tired of getting slapped around by Augustus Heinze about owning part interest in Hennessy's. So they sold out completely to DJ Hennessy and said the store is completely yours. And then that way Heinze could stop telling everybody that the company store was exploiting workers. So Butte wasn't quite a company town. It was a company town, but it wasn't a company town. They didn't print their own script, their own money and so forth. You weren't necessarily required to stay, or in one of their housing units, you weren't required to shop at their store and so forth. But they were pretty darn close. In 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World were created in Chicago. Now, this is every radical organization that you could think of in 1905 coming together in one place and decide, you know what? We should do something. And this is what came out of it. The Industrial Workers of the World was very plain on their goal: overthrow capitalism. Everything that the workers produced and so forth should be for the workers. Capital needed to die. This is a class war. Nobody had done that before. Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labor would no way buy into that. He believed in a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. And he believed that unions could only exist where they could be tolerated. And there shouldn't be any social upheaval involved in that process. And this is why we celebrate Labor Day on the first Monday in September instead of May 1st like the rest of the world. And if you want to hear that one, you got to invite me back. Nobody ever invites me back, so don't worry about it. You're not going to hurt my feelings. So there were a lot of radical elements within the Industrial Workers of the World. Western Federation of Miners was one of the founding organizations of it. The Montana Federation of Labor actually showed up and poked around a little bit because they were interested in the IWW philosophy of organizing unskilled workers, just like they had been doing for the last decade or so. And so there seemed to be some overlap there as well. Mother Jones was there helping organize the IWW, as was Lucy Parsons. Lucy Parsons was the widow of Albert Parsons, one of the individuals who was hung for the Haymarket Square riot, even though he wasn't actually there when the bomb went off in the square. And so she became an activist as well. So the IWW was actually pretty good about pulling in female voices in the cause of labor. And that's kind of how Elizabeth Gurley Flynn gets pulled into the mix as well, even though she would end up having her own issues with the IWW shortly after the free speech fights. 1905 actually saw a pretty good revenge tale, and I should maybe say pretty good revenge tale because somebody actually got murdered, so that's not ever a good thing. But former Governor Frank Steunenberg, who had been around during the Coeur d'Alene strikes of the 1890, entered his garden gate one evening, and the gate exploded, peppering him with wood splinters and so forth, and he died a very painful death a couple hours later. They ended up arresting an individual by the name of Harry Orchard for setting the bomb. Orchard fingered the leadership of the Western Federation of Miners, the ones that paid him to commit the assassination. So the Pinkerton Detective Agency, led by James McParland, went to Denver, and they kidnapped Charles Moyer, George Pettibone, and Big Bill Haywood, and brought them back to Idaho to stand trial. There's no extradition here. There's no really strong evidence that they actually committed it other than Harry Orchard trying to figure out a way to get his neck out of the noose and so forth. Nobody ever said anything about the fact that these three individuals were kidnapped. Anthony J. Lucas wrote a ginormous book about this called Big Trouble. It looks like a doorstop. It reads really quick. It's a great book. It'll tell you everything you need to know about this and what kind of media circle it became. This was like one of the Kardashians committing an assassination back in the day. I mean, you had actors and actresses coming to Boise, Idaho. You had, his name just went, shoop. Lawyer Clarence Darrow, showed up to defend Haywood and Pettibone and Moyer. And a prosecutor by the name of Boroff in Idaho was interested in getting into politics, so he thought that this was a good avenue for him to take and prosecute these individuals, as he could use it as a stepping stone into political office. And he did. He ended up being a senator for the state of Idaho, and he actually has a big mountain in Idaho named after him as well. So they put him on trial one at a time, Haywood first, and Darrow actually got him off. They could find no conclusive proof that the Western Federation of Miners leadership paid Orchard to assassinate Steunenberg. And Orchard's story was so convoluted and had so many holes in it and so forth, it just didn't hold up. And so after Haywood was found innocent, the rest of them they held for a little while, and then just decided they didn't really have a lot to go with. But it's a good instance of where they used private detectives to break up or try to break up a labor organization. James McParland actually had made his bones as a Pinkerton during the coal strikes in Pennsylvania in the 1870s. The Molly Maguires. There's a few of you older folks in here. Sean Connery, Richard Harris. Yeah. Oh, phew. I dropped this on a bunch of IBEW apprentices the other day, and they all just looked at me. Like the original James Bond? Yeah. No, it's not Daniel Craig. Anyhow, so detectives were something that were quite common being used in labor strikes and so forth throughout the United States. The Pinkerton Detective Agency at one point had a larger private army than the U.S. Army. And they used it early and often to break up strikes. Down here at the University of Montana, they have the Anaconda Company's lumber division records and so forth. They actually have some reports from Pinkerton detectives who are infiltrating the camps down in the Bitterroot to figure out who's trying to organize the workers down there. And they make for very, very interesting reading. The strike that I wrote about up in Libby, the Teal Detective Agency had infiltrated that and was doing handwritten reports to the Eureka Lumber Company manager, Charles Wheel, as well as sending him to Governor Sam Stewart, letting him know just about move by move what the IWW was up to. So the use of private detectives to break the strike, in some instances, infiltrate and help ramp up the violence during the strike so federal troops and so forth would be called was really pretty common practice. So the author's to be commended on how he wrapped that into his narrative. How many of you have finished the book? How many of you just started? Okay, I won't give too much of it away. So then we jump to 1907, and we're getting a little closer to the free speech fights. We jump to 1907 because we see a fair amount of strike activity in Montana again in two sectors. One of them is within the telephone companies, and so this is IBEW members who are stringing telephone lines and so forth across the state, and the telephone operators, which were primarily women. And the other group were the loggers along the Bitterroot and the Clark Fork River. Now, Alex Fairgrieve, the gentleman in the slide, was president of the AFL, or the Montana Federation of Labor at the time, and so he was working with all three groups, the telephone operators, the IBEW, and the loggers and so forth. Because the Montana Federation of Labor had helped organize several locals along the Clark Fork River as part of the ALU, they also had organized a number of the telephone operators that were working for the Rocky Mountain Bell Telephone Company. And then, of course, he was working in conjunction with the IBEW to make sure that everybody played fair and by the rules. Fairgrieve was becoming more and more conservative in his approach to labor issues in Montana. One of the reasons that he was doing this was that the IWW really put him off. He didn't like their philosophy at all. Again, he wasn't interested in any type of class revolution or anything like that. He did believe in organizing unskilled workers, and this is why he organized telephone operators and loggers and so forth. So he actually ended up going to Salt Lake City to meet with the president of the Rocky Mountain Bell Telephone Company to see if he could settle a strike for the telephone operators. And while he was there, he met a guy named Charles McNulty, who was president of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, who was there trying to do the same thing for the linemen. And they both came away not satisfied, which is typical for labor issues, right? Not everybody is happy, and nobody gets everything they want. IBEW got nothing for their linemen, so they were still out on strike. The operators, the strike was settled, and so they were told that they could go back to work. Fairgrieve didn't want to get on the bad side of the linemen, so he went and talked to McNulty and said, "Hey, the operators have a deal. What do you want us to do here?" And McNulty said, "You know what? We're fine. Tell the operators that they can go back to work. We appreciate, the solidarity and so forth, but we're good." Fairgrieve comes back to Montana, tells the operators that the strike's over, they can go back to work. The operators say, "What about the linemen?" Fairgrieve says they're still out. The operators say, "We stay out until the linemen have a deal." And they did. So there's that solidarity between the trades and so forth, between skilled and unskilled, because the linemen were considered skilled workers. The operators weren't considered skilled workers until World War I, when it came to the attention of the United States military that men had no idea how to operate a switchboard. So they rounded up a bunch of telephone operators from the United States, put them into the Signal Corps, not necessarily as military personnel, and sent them to France to figure out the communication system for them, which they did. These women weren't recognized for their military service until the 21st century. There's a reason that you organize the unskilled too, because it's always just a matter of somebody's opinion who's skilled and who's not. For the loggers, they weren't so lucky. Fairgrieve was mad because the loggers had made a pretty good deal with the Anaconda Company the previous year from some wage concessions, and actually made a deal with the Summers Lumber Company up in Summers, Montana as well. And then it seemed like all of a sudden I'm going to slide off again. It seemed all of a sudden that the IWW locals wanted to go out on strike again just for the hell of it. So he refused to back them, any of them. And when the ALU locals of the Montana Federation of Labor that were part of that effort asked the ALU to support them, the Butte Miners Union voted en masse not to. So the Western Federation of Miners just helped break its own union, and that was the end of the American Labor Union, when the workers wouldn't stand together on their issues. That also opened the door wide for the industrial workers of the world, and they took advantage in a big way, and began organizing seriously through the Agricultural Workers Organization, and then later on through the Lumber Workers Industrial Union 500. 1909, you have the free speech fight here in Missoula. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn comes to town to break the ordinance. You have Free Speech Corner here in town because of her efforts. Teenager, pregnant, married, and she's packing the jail. And she's making poor loggers stand on a corner on a crate and recite things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And these guys are so petrified of public speaking that they can barely get a word out edgewise. And all they keep doing is signaling the local cop to come over and arrest him, throw him in jail. And Frank Little ends up in town as well for the first time. And he's one of those individuals that are thrown into jail. And they actually pack the jail, just like Flynn planned on it. I mean, she's a hell of an organizer. You got to give her credit. So she packed it, and the city council thought, you know what, we've got a pretty big fair coming up here. We don't need all these individuals locked up in jail. We don't need to continue this, so let's just make the ordinance go away, and you can organize on the street just like the Salvation Army does. Boom. Over. The one knock I'll give against the author, and this won't give anything away, is he doesn't give enough credit to Missoula, Montana, damn it. It started here. Montana. Not a bit player by any means. It might have been a litmus test, but it proved that it could be done. And so they ended up going to Spokane, they ended up going to Seattle, they ended up going to San Diego, and so forth. The Wobblies had a great way of making a tidal wave of insurgency once they got some momentum going. I like to use this slide because they blew up their own union hall. So, Tom, something to be aware of. Stay out of Helena. Stay away from headquarters. Dave, you're retired. You're good. So this is basically the Butte miners, the rank and file members, getting tired of what they thought was a sellout by the leadership of their own union. And so during their own Miners' Day parade, they had a riot. And then they decided to blow up their union hall. And then they decided to start a new union. So the Butte Mine Workers Union and so forth. And they wanted to be independent from everybody. They didn't want to be part of the Western Federation of Miners. They didn't want to be part of the IWW. They didn't want to be part of the American Federation of Labor. They just wanted to go back to being the Butte Miners Union and just representing Butte. One of the reasons that they did this was because in 1912, the union leadership of the Western Federation of Miners and the Anaconda Company came to a deal over the rustling card. And the rustling card was something that the company instituted that said you didn't work on the hill unless you had a card signed by a foreman. If you don't have a signed card, you don't work. That's a blacklist. That's a way to weed out agitators and so forth. And boy, did they agitate. I mean, they started with their own miners' union hall, and then they blew up a hiring shack, or somebody blew up a hiring shack. Nobody's sure who blew up the hiring shack. Somebody blew up the shack. But it was enough for Sam Stewart to call out the Montana Guard to put Butte under martial law, something that would happen early and often from 1914 through 1920s and so forth. What it did also was it opened the door for the leadership of the Anaconda Company, which was no longer Marcus Daly and hadn't been for quite a while, to break the union. And Butte, for the first time since 1878, became a open shop mining town instead of a closed shop. In other words, you could work there and not have a union card. As a matter of fact, if you were going to work as a miner, it'd probably be better if you didn't have a union card. And so John D. Ryan, who was president of the Anaconda Company for the Rockefellers, and Con Kelly both felt that this was the best course of action for them to take at the time. And it was successful. It was very successful. It didn't take long. I mean, once you bring the troops in, the strike's pretty much over. Workers were quick to realize that. There's just no way you could take on the military. And so there was a somewhat uneasy peace in Butte. And as Butte is somewhat settling down, an interesting thing happens in the Dakotas, where some harvest workers that were members of the Industrial Workers of the World heard about what was going on in Butte and decided that they needed to go to Butte and stand in solidarity with the miners. So they did what every good radical labor movement at that time did. They borrowed a train. Because it's a long way from the Dakotas to Butte, Montana. And so they borrowed a terrain from the Great Northern this time, not the Northern Pacific. So if anybody was around in the 1890s and took the oath and for the Northern Pacific, they were good. They made it as far as Chelsea, Montana. Chelsea, Montana. Some of the individuals on the train weren't members of the IWW and decided that they were going to break into one of the tool sheds and rob from it and so forth. And there was a gunfight. You always rob a train. There's always a gunfight. 2 individuals are killed. So the law enforcement has to get involved in the issue, and they do. The sheriff of Plentywood of Sheridan County is tasked with going and arresting what the newspapers are calling a horde of invading IWWs of at least 1,500. He's got nobody but himself. So he sends a telegram to all the local sheriffs in the area and says, please send every set of handcuffs, shackles that you have to Glendive, and I'll pick them up on my way through. He gets to Glendive, he realizes it doesn't matter how many pairs of handcuffs he's got, he's still just one guy. So he gets to Poplar, Montana, and he decides, I need a posse. Just so happens, and again, this borders on the Harry Fritz, but it's not. It's in the news, and if it's in the news, it's the truth, right? Right. Even in 1914. So he gets to Poplar. He needs a posse. Well, just so happens that there is a powwow going on in Poplar at this time. So he deputizes a bunch of the Indian men that are there. And according to the newspapers, they are in full regalia because they are at a powwow. And they mount up on horseback, ride across the hills to Chelsea, and descend on these wobblies to arrest them. Had to be a hell of a sight. I mean, can you imagine that being a silent movie scene? Would have been incredible. So the army of 1,500 turned out to be about 150, which about 2/3 were actually members of the IWW. The rest of them had just been working their harvest and were trying to find their way home. The sheriff brings 3 guys back to Plentywood and questions them and so forth. And the murders, they can't figure out who pulled the trigger first on who. And so nobody's convicted of anything for the theft of the train or the murders and so forth. But Glasgow is left with what's left of this invading army of IWW members. And like Helena, they just don't want them. But they don't send them to Fort Benton. Instead, they load them in refrigerator cars with enough food and water to get them to the Pacific coast, and then they nail the doors shut from the outside. Problem solved. And by now, Governor Stewart in Montana is just on high alert. Something's going to happen. Something's going to break. And so he asks President Woodrow Wilson to station federal troops at Fort Missoula because Montana's about to have an insurrection. Guaranteed. And Wilson kind of hems and haws a little bit, but finally he agrees, and he sends federal troops to Fort Missoula just in case there is the insurrection. The interesting thing is some of the local sheriffs responded back to Stewart's call for them to crack down on the IWW, trying to calm him down and saying, you know what, we really don't have the problem that you think we do. Yes, there are some IWW. Yes, some of them are armed. Nobody's plotting the overthrow of Montana, though. You got to stop reading a newspaper. Sound familiar? Of course, they don't print a newspaper anymore, so it's a little easier not to read it. Then you have 1917, and we're going to cook through this because we're a little bit over time already. This is the strike that I wrote about. If you want to read a really bad master's thesis, you can get it through ScholarWorks through the University of Montana. It's called Montana's Other Strike. It's 160 pages. It's a thesis, so take from it what you will. Anyhow, as I mentioned earlier, this strike started 2 weeks after the United States declared war on Germany. It was the first place federal troops were used to break up the strike. And it actually just trickled down the Kootenai River to Libby, to Troy, then into Bonner's Ferry, and then into eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, and then points west from there until September of 1917, when the federal government decided that they had enough of what was going on, and they began raiding IWW halls across the West and arresting the leadership. And they put about 300 of them on trial in Chicago in 1918 for sedition. These three individuals in this slide were individuals that worked up in northwest Montana. You have James Rowan here, you have Jack Turner in the middle, and Olin B. Anderson on the outside. Anderson was convicted of sedition and sentenced to 5 years in Leavenworth. Jack Turner was sentenced to 10 years in Leavenworth. James Rowan was sentenced to 20 years in Leavenworth for sedition. The interesting thing is that the federal commission, or the federal government's Department of Labor, created a commission to investigate the strike. They came through this area and interviewed individuals about what was going on. Governor Sam Stewart had his labor commissioner do an investigation as well. Both commissions came to the same conclusion. Every reason that the loggers went out on strike was legitimate. Food sucked, pay was worse. There were no bathing facilities for the men. There was no laundry facilities for the men. They packed their bunks from place to place, or their bedding from place to place, so they always had bed bugs and lice, and so forth. So every reason that they went on strike was legitimate. The only thing that broke them was that they were part of the IWW, and they saw that as a revolution against the federal government, which you consider what was going on in Russia at the time. All right, kind of makes sense that they would rush in and break things up. We're going to skip Butte. We're even going to skip Frank Little, because you guys all know about Frank Little, right? Yeah? Okay. We'll just stop real quick on the Anaconda Road Massacre in 1920. This was the IWW's last gasp in Montana. They had been trying for years to get a foot in the miners' union in Butte because Butte's strength as a mining community and as a haven for organized labor and so forth, and hadn't had much success. They decided to strike the Never Sweat Mine in Anaconda in April of 1920. The rumor has it that they were successful in closing every bar in Butte so that the miners stayed on the picket line. That line right there tells you that they were in trouble from the get. As they gathered outside of the Never Sweat Mine a couple of days later to set up a picket, they approached the gates that were closed, and there were a number of individuals on the other side of the fence. Somebody brought a gun and started firing. The newspapers blamed the miners blamed the company. The interesting thing is 7 individuals were shot. All miners, all shot in the back. Tom Manning died 3 days later from peritonitis, from a gunshot wound to the back. He was a young Irishman, only been in Butte for about a year, was trying to earn enough money to bring his family over. And he's buried in the pauper section of the cemetery, the Catholic cemetery in Butte. And that was kind of the last gasp. Governor Stewart didn't even have time to call out federal troops to put Butte under martial law. It was over that quick. The power of the IWW was broken. The power of industrial unionism in Montana was broken as well. You wouldn't see the reorganization of miners and loggers and lumbermen and so forth and smelter workers again until the New Deal in the 1930s. But labor was far from over in Montana. And as a matter of fact, it actually started branching out into different sectors. In 1919, the professors at the University of Montana organized a local under the American Federation of Teachers. The reason they did that is because the Montana University system had a professor, an economics professor at U of M, fired because he wrote a paper about the Anaconda Company not paying its fair share of mining tax. So he got sacked. So the professors created a local. That local still exists today on the campus. It's been around for a long, long time. They also organized a small local of grade school teachers in Missoula about the same time. Short-lived, but it's a seed that was planted, and it's a seed that would grow. And again, in the 1930s, you would see that public union sector start to pick up some steam in Montana, especially with K-12 schools and so forth. And so that's the setting for labor for the breadth of the book, and just a bit beyond, just to give it a little bit of closure. At the end of World War I, the way of handling unions and unionization in the United States fell under what they called the American Plan. Labor called it welfare capitalism. So essentially what they would do is they would grant a few concessions. The lumber manufacturers gathered here in Missoula in 1918 and decided that it was in the best interest of the lumber companies to clean up the camps. Because if they didn't provide bathing facilities and laundries and better food for the workers and so forth, the workers were just a mess. So essentially, they took the demands of the workers and in less than a year turned it on them and made it sound like it was the company's idea to do this. They even had neat little drawings of shower rooms and so forth. One lumber manufacturer had the gall to say, you know what? We're going to make better food for these guys so they eat better. Because if a man gets up from the breakfast table with a grouch on, he's no good for the rest of the day. And that's kind of the way it was for the next decade and a half. Nobody was any good for the rest of the day. Question? Comments? It's hard to end a story that doesn't end. Yes, sir.
I have a question all the way back to the labor stoppage over the strikes from, I think it's Butte, where the workers stopped and they lost 50 cents out of the $3.50.
Yeah, the 1878 strike.
So, I don't know if that was just because it was so rudimentary times or just dumb strategy. Because if you strike and they take away 50 cents, and then you get your 50 cents back and you declare victory, you're not gaining anything. That seems like a weak labor movement. Why didn't they at least go for 360 so the labor organizers say, we got you 10 cents?
Well, because one of the things that I didn't touch on was the fact that 1877 was one of those big economic downturns in the United States. And so that was one of the reasons that you saw the spontaneous strikes the year before, was because the first thing that they did was start cutting wages. So they basically just wanted to get back what they lost so that they could continue to get by. They really weren't interested in making really big economic gains at that point.
And when we see a strike coming, we'll tee it up by cutting the 50 cents. You get back their 50 cents, they think they won something and we didn't lose it at all.
Everybody's learning how to negotiate. Like I said, it's one of those deals where nobody really wins. Yeah.
Can I go ahead and ask that we use the microphone because a lot of folks can't hear the question. So who's next? Here.
Testing, 1, 2. Anyway, I went to a rather good school for high school. The Bear class was American history. We even learned about the Haymarket Affair and strikes, but we never learned about free speech fights. And one would think that free speech was in the Constitution. How was that justified that you could not get up on a box and talk to people at a corner?
Good question. And that was one of the reasons that they were able to eventually break the city ordinances, not just in Spokane, but in Missoula as well, because the example that they used was the fact that the Salvation Army preached from the corners all the time to get members and so forth, and a lot of other organizations did as well. I think it's just a demonstration of the strength of capital at that time and the lack of strength the workers have. What's that?
Those were disturbances, so disturbing the peace was the justification, I gather.
Yeah, I mean they could get him for disturbing disturbing the peace, but they couldn't necessarily. But they turned it into a free speech fight. I get what you're talking about. Yeah, the charge was disturbing the peace for them trying to get up on the fruit box and preach from the corner and so forth, whether they were reading from the Constitution or whatever. But the idea was that they really wanted to put the clamp down on labor, and especially the organization of unskilled labor, what the IWW was doing. And the other thing that you got to remember too is the IWW's reputation was pretty rancorous from the very beginning. I mean, you had the trial in 1905, which even though it wasn't necessarily the IWW, the WFM had been part of founding the IWW, and then you had the organizing and so forth along the Clark Fork and the Bitterroot and so forth in 1907 by the loggers that were there. So, and again, Missoula, almost as much as Anaconda and Butte, was a company town. I mean, it basically the Anaconda Company owned its soul because of Bonner, because of Milltown, and so forth. I mean, you did what you could to step on the neck of labor whenever you could. So if you could pick them up for disturbing this, it was no different than picking up vagrant loggers and so forth and throwing them in jail because they're vagrants and they didn't have any money. So it's like, well, okay, but you throw them in jail, they still have no money. So, yeah, kind of the same principle. Anything else? Yes, sir. Well, yeah, I have a thesis. You can get that online through the University of Montana. Yeah, and it's free, and it should be free. So nobody should be charged to read it. So the professors already paid the price. Anything else? Don't make me remind you I get paid by the hour. I really appreciate you coming out. This is a topic that's near and dear to me. It's hard to believe that I've been doing this since 1997. It's been a minute, and it's been incredible when I get to meet people like you and I get to talk about one of my favorite subjects. And yeah, I get to tell stories about Harry Fritz. Thank you.